please welcome Robert Moody and Allan Kozinn.
Okay, so play ball. I thought what we would do is talk a bit about your 10 years here, looking back, also looking forward to the next week or so at your finale, but also talk a little bit about the music world in general and things that have been going on, because I think in the 10 years you've been here, things have changed an awful lot, generally speaking. So I'm hoping we can get to some of that.
Okay.
But I thought we'd start with the sort of retrospective view, and when you got here in 2008, you must have had particular expectations of the orchestra, of the position. Now looking back, how did the experience measure up? I mean, did you do most of the things you wanted to do when you got here in 2008, and how has it been?
So, how has it been? It's, I mean, really, the word that I can't get away from in this past few weeks, really months, knowing that this final concert is coming, is gratitude. I mean, more than anything, I'm grateful for the experiences that I've had here, and I'm proud of the things that we have done here in the past 10 years. And in my mind, it goes back not to 2008, but actually to 2007. Even before, if you think about the times that I came to audition as a candidate for the job, I was mentioning to you and Bob before we started that it was on the day of my 40th birthday in 2007 when Ari Solotov, the CEO of the orchestra at the time, called and offered me the job as music director. And this coming Wednesday, my final concert will be Tuesday night, May 1st, and I think I might still be having a frothy beverage or two with friends when midnight hits. So really, I will come to the end of that 11-year period from being offered the position to then finishing, the Resurrection Symphony of Mahler, arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest work that exists in the repertory. So it's a nice bookend for me to think of it in those ways. Mm-hmm. In 2007, even prior in 2006, I wasn't. When I first came as a candidate, I wasn't overthinking it. Sometimes, in hindsight, and when I talk to younger conductors and people who are, they found out they're a music director candidate somewhere, I now say to them, I give that advice. I say, don't overthink it. If you become a candidate somewhere, I didn't come in worried to death about whether I would get the job or not. I came in to conduct a Pops concert, was my first offering, and I knew that the search committee had sort of identified a set of conductors they were looking at. There was sort of Tier A, and they were conducting classics concerts as guest conductors. And there was kind of not Tier B, but Tier A, with an asterisk by it, that we were doing some of the Pops concerts. They knew they were interested in the Tier A group, but they wanted to sort of take a look at us as well. And so I was one of those guys, and maybe that's why I wasn't so nervous about it. Uh-huh. I walked onto stage at Merrill Auditorium for the first rehearsal. Actually, our first rehearsals, I think, were somewhere else. But I walked on the stage for the first rehearsal. I looked up. I saw the pipes. I saw the Kachmar organ. I saw the hall. My jaw dropped. And that's the first time I thought, I'd like to get this job. I like this. This is incredible. Then I heard the orchestra play. I recall we did American in Paris on that Pops concert. And I remember thinking, if I'm looking under the hood of the orchestra artistically, are there things that I think I could bring to the table? I thought they sounded marvelous, but I also thought there were things I could maybe bring to the table, and things that might work between us in the way we sort of grew musically. So that's a lot of talking to say the first answer to your question is that I think that we have grown musically and artistically in the 10 years that I've been here, and that's a really good feeling. A lot of it happens now, so that where I was younger, and you grow as a conductor with every passing concert. Right. But where I would spend a lot of time talking and verbally explaining an idea or a concept, now I know how to show that. So I'm a better conductor, and we know each other better. Right. They're mutually building events. I would never speak for an instrumentalist and say they think they're a better instrumentalist because of working with me, but maybe they do. I think more they would say they think there's a strong chemistry, and that's a really nice feeling. The last thing I've done here in the past few months was Heldenleben of Richard Strauss. And I couldn't be happier with that artistic experience. And I was thinking, I was supposed to do one of the concert, and my father passed away, and so I missed the one in between then and now. But I was thinking about that experience and thinking how great that felt to do that, and to think about the musical journey we've come on in the past 10 years. Mm-hmm. We can talk about other things, and I'm happy to, about growing the pop series and the Discovery series and all the things we've done. But
right,
first and foremost, I'm happy that we're making great music that feels like an energetic, buzzworthy, electric journey for me, but really more importantly for the orchestra on stage and for the audience in the hall. It feels like that group of us really are going on some pretty significant journeys in these past years.
So when you said that you felt the first time you heard them and saw the hall that you could bring some things to the table, what kinds of things were you thinking of, and has that all come about?
So every conductor, I don't know if we spend too much time thinking about how to verbalize it, but I'll try and verbalize it. Every conductor has a concept of sound. Mm-hmm. Every musician has a concept of sound. Sure. We just get to be the ones who get to stand up and sort of, guide it. It's the blessing and the curse of being a phenomenal violist or oboist. You bring to the table your very best playing ability, and yet someone in the room, when there's 70 plus people making music, someone's got to say, how fast is it going to go? How slow? How loud? How soft? When are you going to stop? How are you going to begin? In what way are you going to turn the corner from one phrase to another? And that falls to the conductor, to the greatest percentile. So every conductor has a sense of a concept of sound. And if I were to describe mine, it starts with the fact that I know that I made a departure by moving the cellos from the outside to the inside. And I got a lot of comments about that when I first came here. People were like, oh, you've switched around the orchestra. Mm-hmm. Now the violas are closer to the audience, the cellos are more on the inside. Well, there's a method to that madness, and part of my concept of sound is that everything is built from the foundation up. So the most substantive sort of body of sound has to be the bottom. Mm-hmm. And then everything else then has to, sort of falls into place above that. So I like for the cellos, the basses, the bassoons, the trombones, the timpani to all be in a fairly cohesive pie wedge, if you will. And then I start, as much as I can, encouraging players to listen harmonically. So when we're talking about, just playing in tune, listen to that bottom so that you can base how you play atop that, and then listen to each other. Mm-hmm. So for me, there's and I talked about this a lot to the players 10 years ago. I never mention it now, but they know where I'm coming from.
Right.
So when I say the second violins and the first violins have a theme in octaves, and they see me giving the palm to the first violins who are an octave higher and encouraging the second violins to bring out their sound a bit, this goes back to this discussion we had 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think we've done it. I mean, I think we've got a sound that I feel really good about, and it's based. That's the beginning of that sort of too long of a book on sound concept, but that's where it emanates.
No, that's good. Conductors don't always talk about that out loud in front of people. So it's a lot of people feel it's sort of a big mystery what you guys do. You know. Some conductors actually split the two violins right and left, and it gives that sort of antiphonal sound, especially if in a case like you said where they're in octaves apart. Yep. Why did you decide not to do that?
I do it. The only other seating I really really like over the one that we have is when you split the violins. So if you're the conductor, the first violins are to your left, and then the second violins would be to my right. And I use that seating really for Haydn and earlier. Okay. Mozart sometimes as well, but really for Haydn and earlier, because I think it works so much of Baroque music and early classical music is so overwhelmingly based on symmetry.
Sure.
And the symmetry of form, and so I really like it for that. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, I go the other way. And it was only, as it is told, radio and Toscanini trying to figure out how to make the orchestra sound good for the microphones, for the NBC Symphony, that someone first moved cellos to the outside. I mean, strings usually sat in a string quartet seating. String quartets typically first, second, cello, viola.
Right.
Sometimes first, second, cello, viola. Mm-hmm. And I want it to mirror that. So.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't know it was Toscanini's fault.
Well, I blame him.
In terms of the orchestra and its sound and the way the orchestra works as a sort of big musical machine, a conductor has, to some degree, maybe not as much as in the olden days, the prerogative to hire and fire and promote, and you've actually appointed a number of important first chair positions. Most recently, Lauren Winter, the principal horn. Looking at the orchestra and the way it's changed, even if it's just been through retirements or people getting jobs elsewhere, and then you having that prerogative to audition, etc. How do you feel in a way that you've put your stamp on the orchestra that way, sonically?
Well, the 10 years that I've been here have seen a large amount of turnover, and as you said, a key turnover in some principal seats. I mean, my God, John Schnell, John Bowden, Neil Boyer, trumpet, French horn, oboe. These were three giants of music making when I got here, not just for the Portland Symphony, but really in all of New England. I mean, these were known, and in some of their cases beyond New England, these were really known entities and great players. And I feel this way. I mean, if I'm going to say it, I feel this way about the music director search as well. And everyone knows I'm completely Switzerland when it comes to the search for the next person. I keep my opinions fully to myself. I'm stay out of it. But the only thing that I really feel adamant about is that the next chapter be better than this chapter. I mean, it's the only way I feel like we've had success if the Portland Symphony continues to grow and gets better.
Right.
And those kind of thoughts were on my mind, thinking about, when John Bowden came to me and said, I'm going to retire. And he Neil Boyer, same thing. I mean, what admirable and phenomenal human beings. They came to me and said, I'm going to retire, and I'd rather go a little too early than too late. And we were able to really celebrate them. And those are not just big; those are mammoth shoes to fill. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure you do the very best job you can in the auditions. And in the case of Lauren, we got to jaw-dropping principal horn player.
Yeah.
And in the case of all three of those seats, So I look at the orchestra now. I can glance around and note which players are there and who have come since me. Mm-hmm. And I'm proud of really each and every one of them. Mm-hmm. You're correct. It's not I don't know if you all know, but the old days, so to speak, sort of the 40s and 50s there were indeed times when conductors could, and I've heard stories that I do believe are true. Conductors, while point to someone, you're fired. That I didn't grow up in that. I missed that era. So
I think we're back to Toscanini again.
That was never part of my take or makeup, and it's sort of not part of the generation of conductors that I guess I represent. But you do pay attention to wanting to make sure that whomever is next in the job, better is the wrong word. I would never say, I don't know if the next music director is better than me. That's a silly comparison. But are they such a great and energizing fit that they move the organization forward, so that they really inspire the horn section? Yes, in that case, we've done our job really well.
Okay. Shortly after you got here, having first not thought too much about whether you'd get the job, and then being excited about it and coming here, then there was almost immediately a financial, I don't know if crisis is too strong a word, but
nope.
And so you were immediately, thrown into that side of things that is probably not the most interesting thing for conductors to do. You guys want to just make music, but there's budgets to balance and all that stuff. And in Bob Keyes' piece this weekend, which if you haven't read it, you should get your Sunday paper out and give it a read. It's just a fascinating overview of his 10 years. He talks about the degree to which you threw yourself into identifying donors and going with management to talk to donors and all of that. And is that a part of the job that is important? Is it avoidable for a conductor? Is it something that you just absolutely have to do? And did it color in any way the way that the whole job laying before you looked?
So I think that, again, you sort of think about this golden era of conductors, and you look back and you see these really almost like deified names, Schulte and Zell and Toscanini and Stokowski, and it was not just between them and me leading the Portland Symphony, but even between them and the current leaders of most every orchestra in the world, including the top 5-10 orchestras in America. The job has really changed, I think, exponentially. I mean, I think a great example of this came years ago when Daniel Barenboim left the Chicago Symphony, and he cited as a reason for leaving and really just moving the bulk of his career to Europe at the time was that he just didn't want to do the off-podium duties. I think in the case of an orchestra, such an important orchestra like the Portland Symphony, an important orchestra that impacts its region so aggressively, it would be silly to think that you only focus on what happens on the podium. It's the best part, for me personally, by leaps and bounds. Would I rather conduct in rehearsal or performance Mahler 2 or Beethoven 9 or Bartók Bluebeard's Castle than I would go ask for money? Yes, I would rather conduct Mahler by leaps and bounds. But having said that, the orchestra's role is it has to be a 21st century role. And when I got the job here, we would have these conversations with the search committee and the board, and the conversations we had were, how do we make this the most relevant 21st century orchestra we can make it? And the truth is, the PSO had, this is a known sort of story. The PSO had been masking to some extent the financial struggles that it was going through, sort of not hiding, but just not really feeling good about telling that story to its most important stakeholders. And new leadership came in, and by this I don't mean me. I mean Ari Solotov came in, the first of 3 phenomenal CEOs that I just pinch myself that I've gotten to work with here. And Ari, and it's the only thing Bob Keyes wrote such a great article. I cried when I read the article on Sunday. And I think my mother now wants to bring him home for dinner for writing that article. It really was so touching. Bob, was probably just for copy space in the paper, but Bob mentioned that the board chair at the time, when I first got here, Gordon Geyer and I, but he left out at that point. He mentioned him later. He left out Ari Solotov. Ari and Gordon and I, the CEO, the board chair, and I went to so many living room cocktail parties and shared a story, and we each had our portion of the story to tell. The head of the board, the keeper of the institution, the administrative leader, the artistic leader. And we basically said, look, we need to tell it like it is here in 2007, 2008. The orchestra is maybe we're out of out of ICU, but we ain't out of the hospital yet. There's a lot of work that has to be done, and we presented sort of an option of what this orchestra could look like. We could have basically, we used a lot more words to say you could have a mediocre orchestra or you could have a great orchestra. It's up to the community, but we think we can have a great orchestra. So why don't we give it a shot? And here we are now. We've of my 9 completed years, we've completed 9 years in the black. That feels as good to me as doing all 9 Beethoven symphonies. I mean, we should be so proud of that. That's the kind of orchestra we've got.
It seems also to have impressed your new bosses in Memphis, one of whom, when you were appointed, I think the CEO, George Monger, pointed out that you also did this in Winston-Salem, that you've coming to them with the experience of getting 2 orchestras back on their feet financially, and Memphis, I think in 2014, had to lower player salaries and
by over 50%.
Yeah, and
that's their full-time job,
right. And they now have a 6-year program to try and get that back on track, and that sort of corresponds with your first term there. So it's interesting that even though as a conductor you'd rather be conducting, it's actually an important part of your resume. European conductors get away without doing it a lot, but in America, that's just the way it is.
I think it's. I have a good colleague who works in Dusseldorf in Germany, and I think it's beginning to shift even there. They're talking more about sort of what to do for revenue and income, but certainly in the United States, let me just say I'm in a lot of living rooms in Memphis right now. And Memphis is benefiting from the experiences and the lessons we learn here. There's no doubt about it.
Okay. When you began talking about that, you were talking about what can we do to make the orchestra more relevant, and that raises a whole other topic that looks out at the full world of orchestras, particularly. I think the classical music world is actually a little more resilient than people give it credit for. But orchestras, since they're huge machines with lots of moving parts and big budgets, maybe move a little more slowly. There's a lot of pressure now on the classical canon, as it's called. There's a lot of pressure to update it, to change it, to look differently at it. And then, even most recently, we saw Kendrick Lamar get the Pulitzer Prize, which until now has been only classical and jazz. Orchestras, I think, and conductors and musicians of all stripes in the classical music world are looking at different ways to do things. Now, you've got the canon, and on one hand, when the canon is full of, 9 Beethoven symphonies, 9 Mahler symphonies, plus a sort of a part of a 10th and a completion, and Bruckner and Schubert and Mozart and Haydn, it's not stuff you want to abandon. And yet there is a lot of pressure to rethink the repertory, because in Beethoven's day, in Haydn's day, in Mozart's day, the canon wasn't static in the way it is now. How does this pressure, look to you as someone who programs your season? I know you've done a lot of new music. I was showing you before. I had the orchestra send me his entire repertory list, and even if you count, I was going just from the 20th century forward, or from 1900 forward. And so that includes a lot of Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff and composers who are now pretty standard. But nevertheless, 4 pages of music written since 1900 in, I think, 68 programs, or 69 programs. That's actually a lot. So, how do you conceive of the future for you as a conductor, classical music in general, balancing the settled canon and the new stuff?
So a couple of thoughts come to mind. The first is relevancy, and I think that a conductor is one thing. A music director is another thing. If you're a conductor, if I'm invited to guest conduct an orchestra, I'm not required. I may be personally interested, but I'm not required to think much about that town, about what the personality of that town is. They hire me. The Detroit Symphony hires me, and they say, we'd like you to do this work by Gershwin and this work by Rachmaninoff, and I say, okay, and I go and focus on that music. If you're the music director, I think it's a huge responsibility for all the stakeholders, but the music director has to have a key seat, if not the key seat at the table, in talking about who are we, how relevant are we to our times, and the who are we part has to come down to an answer of we are, at one level, the keepers of some of the greatest art on the planet. Mm-hmm. We're the Louvre, Okay. Except we get to perform it all the time instead of just show it to you on a wall, necessarily. We're the Met Museum of Art, except we get to pull it out and bring it back to life on a constant basis. And that decision-making alone about, which Beethoven, of course, you do the 9 Beethoven symphonies, but what else? Are we going to let Creatures of Prometheus just rot away on the shelf? Are we going to bring it back out? Are we going to do Leonora 3 Overture or Egmont Overture? So there's that entire conversation. But I think much more interesting to me becomes how do we merge that incredible music that has had 100, 200, 300 years of, kind of the seal of approval that we know it's good stuff. How do we merge it with current music? Every piece performed was new music at one point in its history, and many of those composers that we rattle off, Tchaikovsky, to a huge degree, Brahms to a great degree. Many of those composers, their first works were not universally accepted as great art.
Right.
It took 50, 70, 100, 150 years to do that. So there's a musical question, and then there's just a relevancy question. I got to Portland, and I came here. I'd been briefly. I just moved to North Carolina, where I had taken over the Winston-Salem Symphony. But really, my thinking was the bulk of my prior time had been with the Phoenix Symphony. So for 8 years, I'd been working for the Phoenix Symphony. We had some amazing concerts. People went crazy for these mariachi concerts that we did. I didn't think that would go so well in Portland.
No.
It was a hunch, but I just didn't. It might go well, but I just didn't think it would have the same resonance, let us say, that it certainly has if you do it. We had done a concert in Phoenix where we had engaged an artist from the Herald Museum. If anyone knows the Herald Museum, it's the largest museum of Native American art. We engaged an artist from the Herald Museum to start with a blank canvas on a platform behind the orchestra. And after 2 hours, the concert was finished. The canvas was complete with this amazing Native American artwork. It's great, but that's pretty unique to the Southwest. Sure. So our conversations were, what works here? What could be interesting for here? And I met so many people when I first got to Portland who came to me and said, well, we've got the coffee series at the BSO. And they would tell me often about what they do. They have season tickets for Portland. They have season tickets for one of the series at the Boston Symphony. They go to Tanglewood. My first thought was, these people are in the know. I mean, these are folks in the Portland community who really do know repertory. And I began to pay attention. I would program certain works, new works, and I might get a more negative reaction. And I would learn from that. It did not mean that I would shy away from that composer in the future. It meant I would retool how I might present that composer in the future. Mm-hmm. I found that I could really, delve into. We did a work here that I think about all the time. We did a work written by a living composer, and at 28 years old, he had a major stroke, and he recovered, and he wrote a piece called Head Case. We paired with Maine Medical. We had a seminar with a neurosurgeon, the composer, also a.k.a. stroke survivor. It was such a powerful experience. Mm-hmm. Weird music, esoteric music, images of his MRI scans on a screen above as we played, audio recordings of him learning to speak again. I mean, this is not Beethoven 7.
Right.
but that was probably in my second or third year, and people still come to me and say, "Hey, I remember that piece you did." So I think Portland. I think you find relevance to what resonates with your community, and then what resonates with you as the conductor and the human being who loves music, and you try and keep moving each other forward. And let us just say real quick, and then I'll shut up. Let us just say that in the day of Beethoven, they didn't do overture, concerto, intermission, symphony. They did 6-hour concerts. They did 3 hours of a concert, went and had dinner, and came back and did 2 more hours. This was so every era has its construct. And for us to push the envelope and figure out the new construct is doing just exactly what we're supposed to be doing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Among the new things you've done, you've done some John Adams, but not a lot of the minimalists otherwise. And even the John Adams stuff really is post-minimalist, neo-romantic now. So I would guess, just from looking at the list, that minimalist you're not that fond of, and the sort of serialist you're not that fond of.
I'm a huge fan of Philip Glass.
Uh-huh.
And I've actually a couple. I've one current and one former CEO out here tonight, and both of them can attest that I've looked for times to try and program the Philip Glass 2 timpani concerto over the years, and also I'm crazy about the Glass opera The Voyage, which he wrote for the 500th anniversary of Columbus discovering America. And there's such great music in that, and I kept trying to figure out a way to get like the finale of Act 2 of the Voyage onto a concert.
But it didn't happen.
No, but maybe I'll put a bug in the next music director's ear.
Okay.
I would say that other than Philip Glass, your serialists, I'm not as, they don't resonate with me as powerfully. I'm a huge John Adams fan, and you may say this in a minute. There's no one who doesn't know that I'm a huge Mason Bates fan.
Right.
He's not only my favorite living composer, he's one of my favorite people. He's one of my best friends, and you all have either really enjoyed a lot of Mason Bates or you've suffered through a lot of it. And I thank you for it either way. But, when I first came here, he was doing well. He was the composer in residence of the Berkeley Symphony in California. Since then, he became the composer in residence of the Chicago Symphony and now the Kennedy Center, the first ever so named. Right. And his opera, based on the life of Steve Jobs, just premiered at Santa Fe. Right. So I feel like I picked a winner on
He's done pretty well, yeah. And I think you've had at least 4 or 5 pieces of his here, 2 of them this season. Yeah. You also have had, and this gets back to the pressure on the classical repertory, you've had music by Jennifer Higdon, Cynthia Wong, and most recently Hannah Lash. Not a huge amount of women composers, but there are orchestras that do none.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of pressure now to think more about women who compose, which, after all, goes back to the 12th century with Hildegard of Bingen, not necessarily your repertory. But all through, there have been some, and now there are tons of them that are quite good. Also composers of color and Asian composers, Chinese, American composers doing really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Do you feel compelled to look specifically into these areas, just as areas, or you just look at it as I want to just conduct good pieces and I don't really care about the gender, color, etc. of who's written them?
I think it would be incorrect to say what I want to say, and what I want to say is no, I don't think about any of those things. I want to find the best music, and I've when it comes to programming, programming comes to me from a multitude of sources. Mm-hmm. My own brain and the repertoire that I love, that I know I love already, from many, many, many times of driving down the road and hearing something on the radio, and back before you could actually look on your screen and see what it was, many times I would just pull over and stop until the piece was finished so I could hear the announcer tell me what the piece was. Mm-hmm. The number of pieces I've programmed and learned to love from that alone is pretty huge.
Right.
People come up to me, audience members, orchestral members, people send me emails, hey, have you ever heard of this composer? I just heard this, I've just heard this amazing piece. You really should listen to it. And that has worked in many cases. At the moment, just a quick aside, I am obsessed with Sibelius' Fifth Symphony. I'm obsessed with it. We did it here recently. And Norman Huen, the first assistant conductor I hired here, who's now assistant conductor of the Oregon Symphony, we were driving to a cocktail party in Portland. And Norman said, he said, I'm crazy about Sibelius 5. And I said, I got to tell you, I don't really know it. He said, well, you got to know it here. And he played it. And that's why I'm now sort of crazy about the piece. All that to say, yes, I read the article that came out in the newspaper a couple of months ago about the dearth of attention being given to minority composers, female composers, and it struck a chord with me. And if anyone looks at next year's Memphis Symphony season, you'll see more female composers, more African American composers. And what's interesting is, was I spurred on to do that because of some nudging? Yeah, absolutely. Then I started discovering some works that I didn't know existed, and I thought, oh, wow, this is a phenomenal work. So you hope that maybe you find a win-win situation, and I think that's what might be happening in the culture right now with a greater attention. Let's be very proactive about female composers, about African-American composers, and again, being relevant to your city, relevant to your part of the world. I'm doing something in Memphis next year that it could be really cool here, but when I tell you what, you'll see why it makes sense in Memphis. I'm doing Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale, which is the story of the soldier who goes AWOL and sells his violin, his soul, to the devil. And in betwixt the movements of A Soldier's Tale, we have a blues musician from the International Blues Hall of Fame, which is in Memphis, playing Robert Johnson tunes. Robert Johnson, the great Crossroads, the man who sold his soul to the devil at the Crossroads, 30 miles from Memphis, Tennessee.
Right.
And people are incredibly excited about that.
Yeah.
And frankly, people are going to come to that concert who would never have come to hear Stravinsky, and they're going to be moved by it. And people are going to come to hear Stravinsky, and they're going to be completely jaw-dropped by the great music of Robert Johnson. Mm-hmm. It's a win-win, and it's relevant.
That's interesting. And it gets us onto the symphonic pops versus classical question. Your orchestra management and I have had a friendly philosophical dispute about the ratio of the Portland Symphony's pops and classical concerts. And what I'm looking at is basically you have 11 classical concerts, really 8 programs with 3 repeats. You have 12 Magic of Christmas concerts. You have 8 pops concerts and 7 educational concerts of some kind. So that comes out to 11 classical concerts and 27 nominally non-classical concerts. I mean, some of the educational concerts maybe. And that is a ratio of almost 3-to-1 pops to classical. I was hoping that perhaps, since nobody has been able to persuade me that this is a good idea, because I being an old geezer, I think that a symphony orchestra should play symphonic repertory, symphony orchestra repertory, classical. I thought perhaps you could persuade me why the pops ratio is a good thing or important, or apart from that it raises money, which is necessary.
So several thoughts come to mind, and I will try and do that which I don't do well, and speak quickly and succinctly on several thoughts. First of all, to say I think that this pops. It's important to know a little bit about the history of pops in the United States. We owe it to the guy who made the first pops orchestra famous, 98 miles from here. It was really Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops who created this concept. Cincinnati Pops came a little bit later, and then after Arthur Fiedler, orchestras got incredibly excited in the 1970s because the speak. Even by the time I was finishing college in the mid 80s, the conversation was still basically the same. We must invest in our pop series because we're gonna lure people to the concert hall who have never come before. They will love the orchestra, and they will transfer over to the classic series. And this is how we will build the next generation of classical music lovers. The truth is, they built the pop series. They lured people to the concert hall who had never been to a concert before. Those people found out and decided they love pop's concerts and had no interest in going to the classical concerts.
Right.
And what's fascinating about the story is that for a number of years, late 80s, early 90s, I remember the first league, it was called the American Symphony Orchestra League Convention back then. I remember the first league convention I went to. They were kind of bemoaning the failure of this. And then somewhere in the mid-90s, someone said, maybe this isn't a failure. We used to have, I'll make up the number, but we used to have 10,000 people over the course of a season attend our classics. Now we have 20,000 people attend our concerts, 10 of them coming to our classics and 10 coming to pops. We should be awfully proud. We've just widened the pie graph. So I think pops are important because I think they widen the number of people you reach in your community. I have nothing against them, but I don't like tractor pulls. And I don't care how much incentive you give me or how much, special ticket bargain you give me. I'm not going to go. I'm just not going to go.
Right.
There are other things that I love dearly that have nothing to do with Beethoven or Tchaikovsky, and I will go.
Right.
The rock groups of my high school and college life, I'll go to those concerts in a heartbeat.
Sure.
So I think pops are important, and I think it's important to say that they should be part of the great canon of overall music that orchestras are involved in. Chris Thiele, the mandolin player, now head of what is changing his name from Prairie Home Companion. Chris Thiele said, the only people who care about music labels are record companies. He said musicians don't care at all about labels. We don't care about genre. Music is music is music. I don't care if it's bluegrass or rock or rap or classical or chamber music. If it's great music, we want great music. Okay, that's the end of that soapbox for now. It's the Duke Ellington quote. There are two types of music, good and bad. But the pops ratio you point out is very important to say. And I think that in an ideal world, an orchestra should, if we could pull it off. In an ideal world, I would personally love to see the lion's share of our work be what we call the classical repertory. I would love that. I also would say that in the case of Portland specifically, the Magic of Christmas is an outlier. Magic of Christmas is, we're the luckiest regional orchestra in the United States. I'm not kidding you. Magic of Christmas is the most amazing experience. It's an incredible concert series. That it has a following greater than most orchestras, 2, 3, 4, 5 times our size. It gives us a financial basis. I said this to you. It gives us a chance, because the financial structure of Magical Christmas is so popular and so strong, I can go to the artistic committee and say, I'd like to stage Bartok Bluebeard's Castle. And they say, okay, let's give that a shot. Most orchestras of our size don't take that sort of thing on. So the classical music lover, if you guys are classical music lovers, you go to that, you benefit greatly here in Portland because of the Magic of Christmas. Even if you have never darkened the door of the Magic of Christmas, you benefit greatly. So that's a key reason. But that's why I always say, if we talk about Portland, we have to set that aside as its own sort of, almost its own foundation, and then talk about the 11 classics versus the 15 or so pops and discovery. That's a good conversation.
But that said, if I remember correctly, the Bartok was packed. And that was regardless of the Magic of Christmas. And in fact, all of the classical concerts, the concert on the classical series, are really pretty well attended. I've been kind of impressed by that. This is a city of like 66,000 people. And the hall is close to full for every classical concert that I go to. So you would think that perhaps there should be maybe more of that. Or how do you figure? I guess there has to be a way of looking at it where you can determine when you're taxing the 66,000 beyond their limit. How do you know where that line is?
Well, so at the moment, the orchestra does 6. If you subscribe to the Tuesday Classical Series, 6 concerts. If you subscribe to the Sunday Classical Series, 5 concerts. When I first got here, there were 6 Tuesdays, there were 3 Sundays, and they were completely separate events. Completely separate. They were never... In fact, we kind of dealt with that as we began to sort of quasi-merge them.
There were no repeats.
There were no repeats.
Yeah.
Everything was a single performance. And so people who are here, who were with me back then, know that one of the first things I jumped on was the fact that we didn't do repeats. Artistically, I believe so much in being able to do a concert more than once. And if you rehearse something 4 times and then only do it once, it's really not the best return on your investment.
Right.
And so I was looking for a stronger return on our investment, and I was looking for ways that we could really have a stronger artistic product and financial product. Because if you do 4 rehearsals and 2 performances for which you gain a ticket revenue, you're going to do better in the financial picture than if you do 4 rehearsals and 1 performance. It's just basic math. So I began the process of saying, can't we put these together? Let's do the... It meant less individual repertory, which is sad. But actually, I think it meant, instead of doing whatever the number was, instead of doing, at the time 8 sets of repertory at maybe A- level, maybe B+ level, I don't know. Maybe we could do 7 sets of repertory or 6 sets of repertory at A level.
Right.
And that was important to me and to us to sort of think about that prospect. And we constantly, I will say that I think the goal, I'm about to leave, so I'm my time ends on Tuesday night. But every year that I got to spend talking about the next year, we always kicked around how can we just nudge the lever forward a little bit? Mm. What can be done? Is it a gala with a special gala with Renee Fleming? Is it a special 90th anniversary gala? That enabled us to do an additional classics cycle the year that we did that, in which Toshi and Bruce and Maestro Vimel joined me on stage. So do we keep nudging the lever forward by special concerts, and then maybe that becomes Tuesday Classical number 7 or number 8? The next music director, I think it'll be a he because the 3 finalists are all he. He gets to lead that charge along with the leadership of the staff and the board next and the orchestra. And so who knows where they'll go. But looking over the 10 years, I'm awfully proud of where we got, to the point to which we got. I'm awfully proud that we do, I think the classical concerts we do at a higher level because we invest sort of more in the repertory for a slightly longer bit of time. Mm-hmm. Do I wish we were doing more? Of course. And no conductor I've ever met wishes we were doing less.
Right.
I wish we were doing more. But I appreciate the power of the non-classical concerts to help energize the rest of the community. Not the rest, the larger percentage of the community.
Okay. That's
what I think is really important. And when I got here, people knew about Magic at Christmas. Bob Keys put it in the paper. I didn't make the story up. The cab driver picking me up at the Jetport. I got in the car. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm conducting the Portland Symphony." He said, Portland Symphony, Magic at Christmas. Love it. Take the kids every year. And I thought, wow, the cab driver knows Portland Symphony. Now, somebody, it's a music directors, we're sort of famous in a 1 mile radius, but I landed at the airport today, and somebody came up to me and said, "Just want to thank you for," I think they saw the article. Thanks, Bob. And they said, "Just want to thank you for your time here." And they said, "Man, we've been going to the Pops," and they said, "And we even went to a couple of your classics concerts." Can't beat that. You really can't beat that.
So I notice in Memphis, financial problems though they are dealing with, you have 10 pairs of classical concerts, and that includes, instead of Magic of Christmas, 2 performances of Handel's Messiah, which Portland seems not to do too frequently, and seems odd to me. But and you also have 5 individual Pops concerts conducted by Andrew Crust. His name sounds awfully familiar. So I guess the question is, whether you are either siphoning off musical talent from Portland and bringing it to Memphis, or is this Portland sort of doing a sort of an occupation of the Memphis musical world?
Well, so first I would go back to the very first thing you mentioned in that set of comments, that Memphis, and this is no secret. In fact, I don't want it to be a secret. We didn't want it to be a secret 10 years ago here in Portland. Memphis is not in good financial shape. And that's a full-time orchestra. It's the full-time job of many of the players. And we've got to right the ship, and the ship is not righted. It's getting there, and some really great things are happening, and there's light at the end of the tunnel, and some people are stepping up, and people are buying tickets, thank goodness. But they allowed the cart to get ahead of the horse. In fact, I would say that existed with many orchestras, and Portland included, in years past. We were doing a lot of concerts when I first got here that really had no financial underpinning, and with a new mantra evolved with the board and with leadership, and the mantra was fund knowns with knowns, KNOWN. We're only going to put on something if we know how to fund it. And that I'm now having that conversation in Memphis to a great extent. I will have to give a mea culpa for Andrew Crust. Andrew Crust was our assistant conductor here at the Portland Symphony Orchestra, and he is the one person I lured to Memphis. And I'm sorry to all of you for doing it. Although I will say it was not that sort of fiendish. The truth is, new music directors very often, like new leaders of many organizations, often like to bring in their own assistants. So there was no necessary guarantee that Andrew Crust and the new music director would be the right fit. So that was on my mind, and he's doing a great job with the Pops and with many concerts down there.
So I'm told I have one more question, and I have quite a few here. Before we go to the audience for questions, and so I guess we really should talk about next week and the Mahler Second. And you've done it here before. You just mentioned that you thought it was the greatest work ever written, although you told Bob Keys the Mahler Third. And I guess, with conductors and musicians of all kinds, it's really whatever is on the stand in front of you gets to be your favorite work.
That's true.
But so why the Mahler Second as your finale?
So I think that a friend of mine, one of my closest friends, is a Presbyterian minister. And he likes to say that he thinks that every minister or rabbi has really one sermon that they just tell over and over and over. One person's might be, God loves you no matter what. One's might be, we are called to social justice, for example. And I thought about that, and I think that for conductors, I think it's actually true as well. And I won't spout my opinions about other conductors, but you can watch other conductors, and I see the way they program. And I do see themes emerge. And I think I can talk about myself. I think in my case, the theme that maybe won't surprise anyone is really we're all in this together. That we, the human beings who are, and I've said this to the audiences before, this concept that here we are in the Merrill Auditorium, there are 1,800 people sitting in seats in the audience, there can be 70 to 200 on the stage with a chorus or not. There's me, there's soloists. That group, 2,000 or so of us, that permutation, that has never been together before in all of human history. And we will never be together again in that exact permutation. And that fact alone just sort of drops my jaw. It makes me feel a great sense of responsibility to the moment. That, okay, we're here. Now we better experience a journey together. Love it, hate it. Just don't be mediocre about it. Don't be in the middle. That stroke piece, by the way, someone at a lunch last year said to me, I never can stop thinking about that piece you did by the stroke survivor years ago. And I said, oh yeah, did you like it? Not at all, she said. But I can't stop thinking about it. That's the job. That's what we're supposed to do. So we're in this journey together, and the older I get, and I turn 50, I turn 51 next week, and the older I get, the more I'm expanding that thought to, it's not just the 2,000 of us in the room that I'm thinking about. It's the 7-point-something billion of us who happen to be breathing at this same moment on this spacecraft that keeps making its annual orbits around the sun. I think about that part a lot. And for me, I've never known where the line was to be drawn between artistry and spirituality. For me, there's never been a boundary. It's not a religious thing at all. It's just the thing that the sixth sensory thing that makes us, somehow more aware that we're part of the greater stardust than other mammals and plants on this planet. And so I'm probably then drawn to the composers who seem to go in that direction quite a lot. Mahler, the top of that pyramid, probably. And there are others, Bach, but others who are in that kind of place. So for me, Mahler, I think, speaks to me in that way. And every time I'm connected to the way he sort of connects nature and the human relationship and the human condition and spirituality, I certainly am most at home with that kind of experience. And for him to write not only the symphony, this 88-minute symphony, but also the words. It's not typical. He wrote the text himself. For him to write the words, rise again, oh rise again, will my dust will rise into, some new thing. And then at the very end, rise again, my soul will rise again in an instant. And everything that we have beaten down, everything, the word isn't so good in English, but everything that we have trodden upon, or frankly has trodden upon us, everything that we've experienced is going to be flung in this glorious way to God, whatever he, she, it is. And that concept and that music and who I am and who I feel about who we are and who we become in 10 years. I was said to you, I mentioned thinking about something like Verdi Requiem or other works as a final piece of Beethoven 9, but truly it was always Mahler too. It always had to be this piece.
Sure. Okay, looking forward to that. Now we'll go to questions from the audience, but there will be someone coming around with a microphone, and please wait till she gets to you before your question. Any hands?
Yeah. Thank you both so much for this evening. I was just wondering how you keep yourself in top physical, emotional, and mental shape. And or, if you prefer, it's a performance day. How many hours of sleep might you have had the night before? What kinds of meals might you be eating? Do you have routines or rituals beforehand?
I do.
Okay.
I'm thinking about some of the people. Carolyn Nishon is here, our current CEO, who has been with me from really the day I started the job. She's been part of the staff from the very beginning, working first for Ari Solotov, then for Lisa Dixon French, and now my partner in crime, and she could probably answer these questions as well as I could. But so I'll work in backwards order. I do have a certain thing I eat before every concert. It's been this way for over 20 years. I eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I've even found when I'm guest conducting and I'm in a hotel, I can call down to room service. It's never on the menu, but you say, do you have a PB&J? They always have one. It's funny to have it come up under a little silver, thing. But I like it's something that I know my stomach isn't going to react abnormally to, and it's at least a little bit of food, so I won't be hungry. I've been also an afternoon napper since college. I religiously take, and I'm grumpy if I can't, I take about a 45-minute nap every day of my life. Yeah. Otherwise, I think conductors. We have one of the longest lifespans. There's studies done of careers, and one of the longest lifespans are conductors.
It's the aerobics.
I think it's twofold. I think it's the aerobic activity, and I think it's the fact that you're enriching your soul on such a consistent basis with such great music. And I'll say it with him here. I said it a couple of years ago when we had our 90th anniversary. The 4 living conductors of the PSO conducted on their 90th anniversary concert. Toshi Shimada did a phenomenal symphonic Metamorphosis, and Bruce Hangen did an incredible Fountains of Rome, and I was very happy with my Also Sprach Zarathustra. Frankly, I thought they all paled completely in comparison to Paul Vermeil, who was already past 90 years old, conducting Egmont Overture of Beethoven. And Maestro Vermeil is here. And I leaned over to Bruce. I mean, he stood on the podium, and he got a sound out of the strings that I had never heard before. And I leaned over to Bruce, and I said, "How did he do that?" He said, "Because he's over 90 years old. He knows he's the only one of us who knows what he's doing." Anyway.
More questions?
Hello, gentlemen. Jay Beadle. Robert, I have a thank you for you. And in defense of more Pops concerts, we also are blessed with 2 incredible music theaters in the state of Maine, award-winning theaters. Sure. And I want to thank you for all of your collaboration that you've done over the years with those performers and bringing local talent in. And it's amazing to see these performers not just have a pit orchestra, but to have the best orchestra in the state of Maine behind them during those performances. So again, thank you for that, and keep the Pops concerts going in Memphis. Thanks. Bye.
One thing I think I would say is that I've thought about a lot in the years. I think it's not better or worse, but I think I'm different. The one thing that makes my work unique compared to another conductor's is that I didn't grow up in a classical music family. This all came to me via the public school system, and getting a cello put in my hand in the 4th grade, and having to sort of convince my father to stop saying Mozart. I mean, it really this is a brand new world for us, and so I found I've high school class of '85, college class of '89. I was the year that I saw George Zell bring the Chicago Symphony to South Carolina to do Mahler 1, was the same year that, 1984 by Van Halen came out. And how do I compare and contrast the two? George Zell and Chicago Symphony and Mahler 1 win. But both things got me very excited as a 16-year-old kid.
Right.
And so I think that I that might be one of the reasons that, that I did John Williams' Close Encounters of the Third Kind on the same concert as the Planets on a Classics here, for example.
Right. But would an orchestra playing Van Halen's 1984 have excited you as much as Van Halen playing Van Halen's?
Correct. No. But
Okay.
no, and some things don't translate and some things do. And that's a really important comment. Some things translate well, but I will say people are figuring out, and a lot of the popular world is figuring out, that the orchestra is actually the world's greatest synthesizer. Mm-hmm. You have that many instruments on stage. What a playground for someone who's an arranger or a composer to come up with such incredible, colors and sounds.
Well, Procol Harum in 1971 with the Edmonton Symphony.
And and many, from the Beatles to others, many people began delving into how that worked.
Do we have more?
Don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy. Here's someone.
Can you raise your hand up high if you have a question? Thank you. And thank you for waiting.
With the wide variety, going all the way back to, really Bach and before that, and then up to the modern stuff, I'm curious as to which you have found the most difficult to manage in an orchestra, because there is such an incredible variety.
So really, the job, the way you approach, I think, an orchestra as a conductor, I'm becoming more and more aware how much it changes over time. And these are too simplistic of terms, but to put it in those terms just for a moment, when you're younger, when you're 27 and you're on the podium, it's really hard not to think about yourself. You know, you're so caught up. Everything from what do I look like to, and more poignantly, the trumpet player just looked at me funny. Now I cannot stop obsessing on that. He hates me. He hates my tempo. You're just those kind of, and I've talked to conductors sort of at all levels, from the great orchestras down. And everyone, admits to that. There's such a swirl of activity, and there's a way in which you're a bride on her wedding day on that. It's hard to get focused on what's really important. And I start with that story because at that point, I would have answered the question and said, well, Rite of Spring is, Stravinsky, A Soldier's Tale, Prokofiev Fifth. Then Copland. Oh my gosh, the Copland Third Symphony or Appalachian Spring, those are the hardest pieces because there's so much mixed meter and you're having to change tempos and you're having to, there's just a lot of this going on. And so you're having to prove to everyone that you can juggle several balls at once. Now, the farther I get into this, the more I realize that's the least fulfilling, both for the conductor and for the orchestra, part of the job, I think. The much greater part of the job has so much to do with, what do I think about this music, and what can I, maybe with a bit of ESP, suss out that you, my colleagues playing the music, think about this work, and how do we find the most perfect phrasing for us right now? And it has much less to do with play with me right here and make sure it has much less to do with that. So those are just a few comments of a larger conversation to say, I just did Marriage of Figaro for 3 weeks, Mozart Marriage of Figaro with the opera company in Charlotte. Finding the phrasing in those arias and the sextet and the finale of Act 2, much more difficult than the Rite of Spring. Much more needing of real, brain and soul work to do that. And my teacher, he was right. My teacher at Eastman basically made his students make a solemn promise. We would never even think about conducting Brahms' Requiem until we were 40. And we would not touch the St. Matthew Passion or the B minor Mass of Bach until we were 50. He was on this. Earlier on, I thought, well, I'll do what he says. And I did. I waited. But he was absolutely right. Because those works, there's such a... And there's a reason they're still around 300 years later. And it's not because of the notes on the page. Those notes on the page have a striking simplicity compared to, any work by Stockhausen or John Adams or Mason Bates. But to find the power and the phrase in those is the thing.
Next question. Almost saw a hand go up.
If you have another one, Allan.
Oh, I have tons. Well, I was going to talk a little bit about interpretation. As you know, I don't know, probably most of them know, over the last century or so, the pendulum has swung, from one side to the other in terms of whether the notes in the score are, absolute, restrictive, should be performed literally, which is something that sort of Toscanini almost more or less started, and then the early music movement picked up, even though they actually do get some of their own personal ideas in there. They kind of don't admit it a lot. And at the other end, at the earlier end of the 20th century, conductors felt that, okay, this is a blueprint, and I have things to say about this music, and I'm going to do it. We were talking about Mahler before, adding doublings and doing all kinds of things to major works. I was wondering, just listening to the concerts I've heard of yours, you would seem to lean a little more towards the personalized style of conducting. And I'm just wondering, as a conductor, again, it's a thing where you look around and you see what the dominant style of the day is, and yet you have your own ideas.
Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
There are times where you may or may not have known it if you come to our concerts, where you have not heard exactly the notes that the composer gave. But in my case, small variants. And I can think of a very few items that are only my own, came only out of my own brain. Mostly because I know that there's a convention that certain conductors over the years, a piece that's 100 or 200 years old, have started saying, well, we could make this moment more powerful if we did such and such. And I've done such and such on occasion. But actually, so I'll give you a couple examples. The Berlioz Symphony Fantastique, there's a place in the end of that, it's the Dance of the Witches' Sabbath, and there's a place where he asked for the strings to play collegno. Collegno is Italian for with the wood, and that means they kind of turn the bow over, and instead of using the hair, they kind of beat the strings with the wood of the bow, and it gives this good kind of percussive clacking sound. And I had, actually, for a number of years, when I did this piece, I would ask a snare drum player to take the lightest weight sticks and also play the rhythm on the rim of the snare drum, because it just makes it more present to the audience. And then, can I tell this story, Maestro Vermel? Then I did it here, and Maestro Vermel sent me a letter telling me that from his days in Paris, that there was a convention back in the day of not doing what I did, but actually asking the trumpet players to loosen their valves. If anybody plays trumpets, if you loosen the valves and then you depress the valves, you get this clack, click, click, clack sound, clicchetti. And I took him up on it immediately. And so when you heard the Dance of the Skeletons, if you recall that concert and you thought, my God, am I hearing a lot of bones rattling? You were. We were upping that moment quite a lot. We did the 9 Beethoven symphonies here, which is one of the things I'm extremely proud of. All 9 symphonies, 1 conductor, 1 orchestra, 1 concert hall. And when we did the 9th, for example, and I'm not the first to do this, at the very end, the chorus is just finished, Freude schöne Goethe funken, Goethe funken, and the orchestra takes off. And I add the trumpets to the very end. Beethoven didn't write it, but I had the orchestra's playing, and I had them play, along with that ending. And I'm not the first. I mean, many conductors do that. So things like that I've added, and in the Mahler there are a couple of things. So, Bernstein, I'm paraphrasing, but Bernstein once said, the job of the conductor is not to give you, the orchestra, the audience, the moment. It's not my job. It's not the conductor's job to give you exactly what the composer wanted. That's silly. How would we know? In most cases, they're dead. And even with the great scholarship you can typically find one scholar who tells you absolutely that, Avenue A was the correct avenue, and an equally respected scholar says absolutely not. It was Avenue B is the correct way to approach this. So it's not our job to give you what they wanted. It's also absolutely not the job to give you what I want. Only me. This is not an ego trip. It's not for me to do something so silly as to bastardize the music. That would be like painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. You don't do that. It's your job to give the greatest homage I can make of what I think the composer would have endorsed. And if I walk out on stage and I do that. There's a time I'll tell you a good story. I was doing Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and in one of the cadenzas, I'm not going to say where, or it wasn't here, but it was in a state that had a sort of a well-known theme song for that state. And in the cadenza, she suddenly started playing a bit, very obviously, the theme song, like the state theme song. We did 3 performances. She only did that for the first performance. I made sure of it.
In a cadenza, you could argue that there's some leeway,
but for me, that was a mustache on the Mona Lisa. Mm-hmm. That was just too far.
Okay.
Just one more question from the audience here.
Are there any questions out there?
Robert, it's Peter Plum.
I know Peter Plum.
What are you going to miss most about the state of Maine and Portland and your orchestra here?
And my orchestra here, it's important you said the last part, because one of my knee-jerk reactions was to say some of the best conversations I've ever had in my entire life sitting around the table with Peter and Pam Plum are the things I will miss. I will miss dear friends, those guys included. I will certainly miss the dear friends I've made who really feel more like family than just friends. I will miss the hall greatly. Memphis, we're blessed to have a really stellar concert hall. Acoustically, it's fantastic. No organ. I will miss Merrill Auditorium. I will miss the music we can make and program unique to Portland because of the hall, because of the organ. I will miss and I don't know if this is, I really don't know if this is in New England. I don't know if this comes to 300 plus years of Portland and its great history. I don't know if it comes from both Portland and also Boston and so many great arts institutions being nearby. But I will miss, I've never been in a place in my life where people are not just a little bit, but a lot proactive about being educated about the greater depths of the music. I've gotten more informed emails telling me what they supported, what they liked that I've done, and more importantly, what they didn't like. And that's a huge help. And it's a huge help. And it also says, my God, I can't believe how engaged this audience is. You referenced it tonight. Most orchestras around the country are praying to see if their hall will be more than 55% full. We barely have a classics concert that isn't nearly sold out. It's a town of, depending on how you decide to talk about the demographic, it's 60,000 in the city, or maybe 150, 200,000, depending on how far you want to call the greater Portland area. Mm-hmm. Portland, Maine, if you aren't already, take joy in being proud of this art scene in this town and of this orchestra. You've got something that almost no region has anywhere in the country. And I didn't let a day go by that I didn't think about that and wasn't grateful for that. And it's the people of Portland who show up and razz me about too much Beethoven or too much John Adams or too much Mason Bates. Man, that kind of proactive energy and love for the art, I wish I could copy this and take this everywhere around the country. So I thank you, representing Portland, for that.
Okay. So thank you so much for doing this, and thank you all for coming. And that's a wrap. So good night.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Really appreciate it.